Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Today, we have a story about a poor student who agrees to marry a wealthy, much older woman, a millionaire, just to get by. But what happens in the 7 days that follow will completely change his life, and he'll realize that the money and luxury he thought would bring him happiness are nothing compared to the truth he uncovers about himself, love, and his new life. Let's see how this story unfolds. Please stay tuned for part 2 of this story, where Mark finds himself in a life of luxury, but realizes that nothing is as simple as it seems. Mark's decision was made. He walked back to Brooks' Bistro the next day, his mind still heavy with doubt, but knowing that the offer Eleanor had extended was his only way out. As he entered the bistro, he saw her sitting at the same corner table, her poised figure the same as the day before. There was no sign of hesitation in her eyes as she looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "You're here," she said, as if it was expected. Mark sat down opposite her, the weight of what he was about to do settling in his chest. "I'm in," he said, his voice firm despite the inner turmoil. Eleanor nodded, not missing a beat. "Good. We'll start the paperwork tomorrow. You'll have everything you need." She glanced at him over the rim of her coffee cup, her gaze sharp. "This isn't about love, Mark. It's just a formality. Nothing more." "Understand." Mark nodded, though inside, a small part of him questioned what he was getting himself into. But he couldn't back out now. His family needed this, and it was the only solution he had. After the meeting, he walked back to his small apartment, his head swirling with thoughts of what lay ahead. His mother was waiting for him when he returned, her tired face lighting up. When she saw him, "So what did she say?" she asked, hope in her eyes. Mark sat down heavily on the couch. "It's done. I've agreed to marry her." His mother's smile faltered slightly, but she didn't say anything. She knew he was doing this for them. The next day, Mark found himself at Eleanor's mansion, the grand house towering over him as he stepped out of the car. The estate was everything he had imagined, luxurious, cold, and impersonal. He was led inside by a housekeeper, who showed him to a large, opulent guest room. Everything in the room screamed wealth. Dark wood furniture, rich fabrics, and large windows that looked out over manicured gardens. Mark sat on the edge of the bed, feeling out of place. He wasn't used to this life, this world of opulence and control. But it was only temporary, he reminded himself. Eleanor had made it clear this was a business arrangement, nothing more. Over the next few days, Mark began to adjust to his new life. He attended meetings with Eleanor, got accustomed to the high society events, and slowly, he started to feel like he was becoming part of this world, though it was still strange to him. He kept his distance from Eleanor, as she had instructed, treating the entire thing like a formal business partnership. Yet, in the quiet moments, when she wasn't watching, he found himself thinking about her more often than he cared to admit. There was something about her, something beneath her cold exterior that intrigued him. She was sharp, calculating, but there were times when she let her guard down, just for a second, and Mark couldn't help but notice. It was during one of these moments, at a charity gala, when their eyes met across the crowded room. She was speaking with a group of investors, her posture perfect, but when she saw Mark, there was a brief flash of something in her eyes. For just a second, the wall she had carefully built around herself seemed to crack. Mark couldn't explain it, but it made his heart race. After the event, he found himself alone in a corner of the ballroom, nursing a glass of wine, trying to process what he had felt. That's when Eleanor appeared beside him. She didn't speak at first, simply stood there, her gaze fixed on the crowd. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and quiet. "Are you having second thoughts?" Mark turned to look at her, the question hanging in the air between them. "No," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed his own words. "This is just more than I expected." Eleanor gave a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "It always is. But this is the way it has to be." She paused, then added, "You'll get used to it. It's just business." Mark nodded, but in his heart, he knew it wasn't just business anymore. The lines were starting to blur. Later that night, when they returned to the mansion, Mark couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had happened in the past few days, the strange feeling that had started to grow between him and Eleanor, and the way her cold demeanor sometimes softened in moments of vulnerability. He couldn't deny that there was more to this than he had initially thought. As the days passed, Mark continued to play his part, attending events with Eleanor, and each time, their connection deepened. But despite their growing closeness, there was still a wall between them, one that Mark couldn't quite understand. He wanted to know the woman behind the business arrangement, but Eleanor kept everything at arm's length, never letting him in completely. It was then that Mark realized that maybe this wasn't just about him. Maybe, just maybe, Eleanor needed him as much as he needed her. Mark continued to adjust to his new life with Eleanor. The days blurred into one another, filled with meetings, lavish dinners, and high society events. But despite the outward appearance of success, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Eleanor, though always poised and confident, remained an enigma. There were moments when she would let her guard down, but they were fleeting, like a crack in a wall that was quickly sealed. It was during one of these moments, at another gala, that Mark found himself staring at her, wondering what lay beneath her composed exterior. She was talking to a group of investors, her usual commanding presence in full force. But when their eyes met across the room, there was something in her gaze, something soft, something that Mark couldn't quite place. He couldn't stop thinking about it, even as the evening went on. After the event, as they were walking out, he found himself alone with her for a brief moment. She didn't say anything at first, her expression as unreadable as ever. Finally, she spoke. "You're quiet tonight," she said, her voice betraying a hint of curiosity. "Just thinking," Mark replied, his tone neutral. "About what?" she pressed, her eyes searching his. Mark hesitated for a moment, then said, "About us." Eleanor raised an eyebrow but didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned and started walking towards the exit. "We're just doing what we agreed on," she said, her voice cold and dismissive. Nothing more, nothing less. Mark followed her, the silence between them heavy. He couldn't understand why he felt this way. He knew this wasn't supposed to be real. It was just a contract, a business arrangement. But still, something about her presence made him question everything. Later that night, when they returned to the mansion, Mark found himself lying awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind was racing. He had always known he was playing a part in this arrangement, but now, it felt different. Eleanor was beginning to affect him in ways he hadn't expected. Despite the coldness, there were these small moments of warmth, tiny glimmers of something real. But every time he thought they were getting closer, Eleanor would shut him out again, retreating into the persona of the powerful businesswoman. The next day, as they sat in her office, discussing more business matters, Mark couldn't help but notice the way Eleanor carried herself. She was brilliant, no doubt about it. But there was something more, something vulnerable that she kept hidden behind her sharp, unyielding exterior. He found himself wanting to know more about her, to break down the walls she had built around herself. "You've been quiet today," Eleanor said, looking up from the documents in front of her. "Are you sure you're all right?" Mark paused for a moment, unsure of how to respond. "I'm fine," he said, his voice a little too sharp. "Just thinking." She raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. "You know, you're a good actor, Mark," she said after a moment, her tone light, but with an edge of something deeper. "I didn't expect you to play this role so well." Mark frowned, wondering what she meant by that. "What do you mean?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew. Eleanor set down the papers and looked directly at him. "You've been pretending to be just another rich, entitled man all along. But I see through it. You're not like them." Her words hit him harder than he expected. "I'm just trying to survive," he said quietly. "And you think this is your way out?" she asked, her gaze piercing. "I don't know," Mark admitted. "But maybe it's a way to make things better." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her eyes studying him carefully. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, she said, "You're not the only one pretending, Mark." Her words hung in the air between them, a heavy silence filling the room. Mark looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" She stood up and walked over to the window, her back to him. "I've been pretending too," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "Pretending that I don't need anyone. Pretending that this life, this cold, lonely existence, is all I want. But it's not. and I don't know how much longer I can keep up this act." Her admission took Mark by surprise. He had always seen Eleanor as someone who had everything: power, control, money. But now, hearing her words, he realized how wrong he had been. Eleanor wasn't invincible. She wasn't untouchable. She was just as vulnerable as he was. For the first time, Mark saw her not as the businesswoman who had bought his compliance, but as a woman who had built walls around her heart to protect herself from the very thing she craved most: connection. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he simply watched as she turned away from the window, her expression unreadable once again. The walls were back up, and Mark knew it would take more than just a few words to break through. But for the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to. Eleanor had shown him a glimpse of something real, something raw, and now, he was unsure of what to do with it. Days passed, and Mark found himself more tangled in the web of his fake marriage with Eleanor. The walls she had built around herself seemed unbreakable, and though she had opened up to him slightly, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was still hiding something important. Eleanor, always the composed businesswoman, remained distant, but there were fleeting moments when he saw her vulnerability. The cold exterior, though still intact, cracked just enough for him to notice the cracks. It was during one of those moments that Mark realized how deeply he had become entangled in this arrangement. He had told himself it was just business, but with each passing day, his feelings for Eleanor became more complicated. They were now living together under the same roof, though everything was still mechanical, a performance for the outside world. Yet, Mark couldn't deny the shift that had begun inside him. He found himself wanting to know more about her, to understand the pain that lay beneath her strong facade. He couldn't help but notice how she sometimes seemed so tired, so weary, as if the weight of the world rested on her shoulders. Eleanor had always prided herself on being self-sufficient, but Mark could see through the carefully constructed mask she wore. She needed help, even if she wouldn't admit it. He wanted to reach out to her, to offer her something real, but he still wasn't sure how. One evening, as they were returning home from another gala, the tension between them felt thick in the air. Mark glanced over at Eleanor, who was staring out the window of the car, lost in thought. He had always been able to read people, but Eleanor was different. She was an enigma, a puzzle he couldn't solve. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, breaking the silence. Eleanor turned to him, her eyes a little tired, but she quickly masked it with her usual calm demeanor. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice steady but distant. Mark could see the way her jaw tightened, as if she was holding something in. "You don't have to pretend with me," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "I know you're not fine." Eleanor's gaze hardened, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes, something softer. She turned away from him, staring out the window again, her silence almost suffocating. Mark wasn't sure what came over him, but before he knew it, he reached out and placed a hand on her arm. The gesture was simple, but it felt like a bridge between them. She tensed at first, then relaxed, her body language shifting ever so slightly. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show him that there was more to their relationship than just the cold contract they had signed. For the first time, he felt a genuine connection with her, even if it was small and fragile. When they arrived home, the night was quiet. They both sat in the living room, the silence between them heavy, but not uncomfortable. Mark couldn't stop thinking about the way her hand had relaxed under his touch, and how it felt like a small breakthrough. But just as quickly as it had come, the moment passed. Eleanor stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the moonlit garden. "This isn't supposed to happen," she said softly, more to herself than to him. Mark didn't know what she meant at first, but then it hit him. She was talking about the feelings between them, the growing connection that neither of them had expected. "You don't have to pretend, Eleanor," Mark said quietly, standing up and walking toward her. "I know this was supposed to be a business arrangement, but we're more than that now." Eleanor didn't turn to face him, but he could see her shoulders tense slightly. "This was never meant to be real," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it is," Mark said, stepping closer. "It's real for me." There was a long silence, and for a moment, Mark thought she might walk away from him, shut him out like she had done so many times before. But instead, Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "You don't know what you're saying," she replied, her voice quiet but filled with emotion. "You're just confused. This isn't how things were supposed to be." Mark reached out, taking her hand gently in his. "Maybe things don't have to be the way we planned them," he said softly. "Maybe we can choose our own path." Eleanor's eyes softened for a moment, and Mark felt a surge of hope. Could it be possible? Could they really turn this fake arrangement into something real? As he looked into her eyes, he could see the walls beginning to crack, just a little. Eleanor didn't pull away from him, didn't shut him out. And for the first time, Mark allowed himself to believe that there was hope for them. That maybe, just maybe, the love they had built on the foundation of a contract could grow into something more. But as he held her hand, he knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Eleanor had been hurt before, and there were deep wounds she wasn't ready to face. But Mark wasn't going to give up on her. He would be there, even if it meant slowly breaking down the walls she had built around her heart. The journey was just beginning, and Mark was ready to see where it would lead. The days after their conversation were filled with a strange tension between Mark and Eleanor. The walls between them had started to crack, but neither of them knew how to handle the new feelings that were beginning to surface. Eleanor, as composed as ever, continued with her business like nothing had changed, but Mark noticed the subtle shifts in her behavior. She seemed more distracted, more distant at times, but there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when he saw a crack in her perfect armor. She would glance at him differently, as if she was trying to understand the man behind the contract. Mark, too, found himself constantly thinking about Eleanor. It was hard to ignore the way her eyes softened when they were alone, the way her voice would catch when she spoke of her past. He could feel her pulling away, but he also felt something more, a connection he hadn't expected to form in this fake arrangement. The moment they had shared in the living room, when he had reached for her hand, lingered in his mind. It had been small, but it felt significant. It felt like a shift, a turning point. And yet, Eleanor kept pushing him away, retreating behind the walls she had built to protect herself. The more Mark tried to get closer, the more she pulled back. He knew she was scared of what it meant to truly let someone in. She had built her empire on control, and now, she was losing it. Her heart was a fortress, and he was starting to realize that breaking through was going to take more than patience. One evening, as they sat at dinner, the tension between them finally reached a breaking point. Eleanor was more distant than ever, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. Mark couldn't take it any longer. "What's going on, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. She looked up at him, surprised by his question. "What do you mean?" she replied, her tone defensive. "I mean, we've been living like this for weeks now, and nothing has changed. You keep pushing me away." Eleanor's expression hardened, and for a moment, she was silent. Then, her eyes softened just enough for Mark to catch the vulnerability in them. "This was never supposed to be real," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted this to be real." Mark's heart sank as he heard the pain in her voice. He could see it now, the fear, the regret. She had never planned on falling for him. This had been a transaction, a way to solve problems, not a love story. He reached across the table and gently took her hand, his touch reassuring. "But it is real, Eleanor," he said softly. "It's real for me." Eleanor pulled her hand back, her eyes darting away. "You don't understand," she muttered. "You don't know what it's like to lose everything, to have to build something from nothing." Mark leaned forward, his eyes locked onto hers. "I may not know what it's like to lose everything, but I know what it's like to feel alone. And you don't have to be alone anymore. You don't have to push me away." She stared at him, her expression unreadable. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words and emotions that neither of them knew how to handle. Finally, Eleanor stood up abruptly, walking over to the window. She stared out at the garden, her back to him. "I can't do this, Mark," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't let myself feel something for you. I can't let myself need anyone." Mark stood and walked over to her, stopping just behind her. He didn't touch her, but he was close enough for her to feel his presence. "You don't have to do this alone," he said quietly. "You don't have to carry all of this by yourself." Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes wet with unshed tears. "I've spent my whole life building this empire. I can't let it all fall apart because of this," she whispered, gesturing between them. Mark's heart ached for her. He could see the weight of her fears, the burden of her past, and for the first time, he understood. She had been alone for so long, hiding behind her wealth and power, and now she was terrified of being vulnerable. Eleanor, Mark said gently, you don't have to choose between your empire and love. You can have both. Her eyes searched his, as if trying to decide if he was lying, but Mark didn't flinch. He meant every word. You don't have to carry all of this by yourself, he repeated, his voice steady. For a moment, Eleanor stood there, her face a mixture of emotions. Then, slowly, she reached out and took his hand. The contact was light, hesitant, but it was enough. I don't know if I can do this, she whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know if I can trust anyone again. Mark gave her a small, reassuring smile. You don't have to trust me all at once, he said softly. But I'll be here, no matter what. The weight between them seemed to lift, even if just for a moment. Eleanor didn't pull away this time. She didn't shut him out. She let him in, just a little. And for the first time in a long time, Mark felt like they were on the verge of something real. Something that wasn't just a contract, but a partnership. A partnership built on trust, understanding, and, maybe, love. The next few days passed in a quiet haze. Mark and Eleanor continued their routine, but something had shifted between them. The walls that had separated them before were no longer as impenetrable. Mark could feel it, the change in the way she looked at him, the subtle way she let her guard down when they were alone. It was as if she was starting to trust him, even if she didn't fully realize it yet. Eleanor, for her part, still kept her distance at times, but she no longer recoiled when he reached out. And that, for Mark, was progress. He knew it wasn't going to be easy. Eleanor had built an entire life around control, around not letting anyone close. But with each passing day, she seemed to be loosening the reins, just a little. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony of the mansion, the sky painted in hues of pink and orange as the sun set, Mark couldn't help but notice how at peace Eleanor looked. For the first time, she wasn't rushing to put up her walls, to hide behind her wealth and status. She was simply there, in the moment. With him. Mark reached for her hand, and this time, she didn't pull away. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she turned to him, her gaze soft and contemplative. I never imagined it would be like this, Eleanor said, her voice almost a whisper. Mark gave her a small smile. Like what? He asked, his thumb brushing over her hand. She glanced down at their intertwined fingers, then back at him. This. Us. I never thought I'd be here. With you. Letting someone in. Mark's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't much, but it was everything. You don't have to be afraid, he said gently. You don't have to do this alone anymore. Eleanor exhaled softly, her eyes fluttering closed for a brief moment. I've spent so much of my life building this empire. I forgot what it was like to let someone in, to actually need someone. I was so focused on control, on power. I thought that was all I needed. Mark reached up and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering on her skin. And what about now? He asked softly. She met his gaze, her eyes vulnerable, raw in a way that Mark had never seen before. Now, I'm learning. I'm learning that maybe I don't have to be in control all the time. Maybe it's okay to let go, just a little. Mark felt a surge of hope, a warmth that spread through him. This was what he had been waiting for. This was the moment he had been holding on to. Eleanor, he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. You don't have to change who you are. I'm not asking you to give up your empire or your power. I'm just asking you to trust me. To trust us. She looked at him, and for the first time, Mark saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. But there was something else, too. Something more powerful. Hope. I don't know if I can do that yet, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to see where this goes. Mark's heart swelled at her words. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. It was more than he had expected. And for the first time, he believed that maybe, just maybe, there was a future for them. One that wasn't bound by contracts or business deals. It was a future based on trust, on something real. They sat there in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation settling between them. The sun had long since set, and the cool night air wrapped around them, but neither of them made a move to get up. It was as if time had stopped, and for that brief moment, it was just the two of them. Mark didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going anywhere. He would be there, no matter what. And Eleanor, despite all her fears, despite the walls she had built, was finally beginning to let him in. As the night grew darker, Eleanor turned to him once more. Maybe we can figure this out, she said softly, her voice filled with quiet resolve. Mark smiled, his heart light. We will, he said, squeezing her hand gently. Together. And for the first time, Eleanor allowed herself to believe it. The days after that quiet conversation on the balcony were filled with a new kind of tension, a tension that wasn't born from distance, but from the unspoken hope that had begun to grow between them. Mark and Eleanor had crossed a line, not in the sense of betrayal or deceit, but in the way they had started to truly see each other. They weren't just two people playing a role anymore. There was something real developing, even if neither of them was fully ready to name it. Mark could feel the change, but there were moments when he still questioned whether this fragile connection could last. Eleanor, despite her growing openness, was still guarded. The empire she had built was not just a business. It was her shield, the only thing that had ever made her feel in control. And now, Mark was asking her to let go of that control, to trust him, and to trust them. He knew it wasn't easy for her. The following week, Eleanor took Mark to a gala, another one of her carefully curated events where power, influence, and wealth were on full display. But this time, something was different. As they walked through the grand doors of the venue, Mark couldn't help but notice how Eleanor seemed less like the commanding businesswoman and more like someone who was finally letting herself be seen. She walked beside him, her hand brushing against his, a gesture that was no longer cold and distant but warm, almost reassuring. They made their way through the crowd, mingling with guests, and for the first time, Mark didn't feel like an outsider. He didn't feel like he was just a prop in Eleanor's life. She was there, truly present with him. After a while, they found a quiet corner of the room, away from the noise and the constant flurry of conversation. Eleanor stood by the window, looking out over the city, and Mark stood beside her, his presence steady and comforting. You know, she said softly, breaking the silence. I never thought I'd be doing this. I never thought I'd actually let someone in. Not like this. Mark turned to look at her, his heart heavy with emotion. You don't have to let go of everything, Eleanor, he said quietly. But I can't do this without you. I need you to trust me. She turned to face him, her eyes searching his, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to fade away. I'm trying, she whispered. I really am. There was a vulnerability in her voice, one that Mark had never heard before. It made him want to hold her, to reassure her that everything was going to be okay. He reached out and gently took her hand, feeling the warmth of her touch. We'll figure this out, Eleanor. I'll be here, every step of the way. You don't have to carry all of this by yourself. Eleanor looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into him slightly, her hand tightening around his. I don't know if I can do this, she admitted, her voice trembling. I don't know if I can trust anyone again. Mark's heart ached for her. He could see the weight of the past pressing down on her. She had been hurt, betrayed, and now she was afraid to give someone else a chance. You don't have to trust me all at once, he said softly. But I'm here. I'll wait for you. They stood there in silence, their hands still intertwined, the quiet of the moment wrapping around them. Mark didn't know how long it would take for Eleanor to fully let go of her fears. But for the first time, he felt hopeful. He felt like they were moving in the right direction. Slowly, but surely, Eleanor was starting to open up, and Mark was more than willing to be there, right by her side. As the evening wore on, they returned to the bustling crowd, but something had shifted between them. It wasn't just the charade of a business arrangement anymore. It was real in the way they looked at each other, in the way they held hands without hesitation. And in that moment, Mark knew that they were no longer just playing a part. They were starting to build something that could be lasting, something that wasn't just about a contract, but about trust and maybe, in time, love. The weeks that followed were filled with subtle changes, both in Mark and Eleanor. Though they still kept up the facade for the outside world, something inside them was shifting. The contract that had once held them together, cold and businesslike, was becoming something else. Eleanor was slowly letting go of her fears, her tightly held walls starting to crack, and Mark was there, every step of the way, showing her that he wasn't going anywhere. The gala had been a turning point for both of them. It was the night they had finally let go of their pretenses, even if just for a little while. As the days passed, Mark noticed how Eleanor had started to open up more. She wasn't as distant anymore, and when they were alone, there were no more walls between them. She still carried the weight of her empire, the responsibility that came with it. But now, there was a softness to her, an openness that had been missing before. One evening, as they sat on the couch in the mansion's living room, Eleanor leaned her head on Mark's shoulder, a rare gesture of vulnerability. The warmth of her presence was calming, and Mark could feel the connection between them deepening. "I never thought I'd be here," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark looked down at her, his heart swelling with emotion. "Here with me?" he asked gently. Eleanor nodded, her hand resting lightly on his. "Yeah, I thought I could never let someone in. But I'm starting to realize that maybe it's okay. Maybe I can trust you." Mark's chest tightened at her words. It was everything he had hoped for, and yet, he could tell there was still something she wasn't ready to face. "You don't have to trust me all at once," he said softly, his thumb brushing the back of her hand. "We can take this one step at a time." Eleanor turned her face slightly, meeting his gaze. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of doubt, but also something else. Hope. "I'm scared, Mark," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I've spent so much time pushing people away, building this wall around me. And now I'm not sure if I can let it down." Mark gently cupped her chin, lifting her face so that she could look at him. "You don't have to be afraid," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not asking you to change overnight. I'm just asking you to let me in, little by little. We'll figure this out together." Eleanor's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, Mark saw the woman behind the empire, the woman who was capable of so much love, so much warmth. She was beginning to let herself believe in the possibility of something real. "I want to believe you," she whispered. "I really do." Mark smiled, his heart light with the hope that maybe, just maybe, they were on the verge of something beautiful. "Then believe in us," he said, his hand gently squeezing hers. "Believe that we can make this work." They sat there in silence for a while, the weight of their conversation lingering in the air. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was a silence filled with understanding, with the quiet promise of what was to come. For the first time, Eleanor didn't feel the need to run from the connection between them. She was allowing herself to feel it, to acknowledge it. And Mark, for his part, knew that he was willing to do whatever it took to make her feel safe, to make her feel loved. Later that night, as Eleanor stood by the window, looking out over the city lights, Mark stood beside her, his presence steady and unwavering. She glanced at him, her eyes soft, and for the first time, she didn't look away. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice filled with gratitude. "For not giving up on me." Mark reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "I'll never give up on you," he said softly, his voice filled with certainty. "We're in this together. And I'll be here, no matter what." Eleanor smiled, the expression genuine and warm. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't alone. And for Mark, it was a moment of pure hope. The journey they had started together wasn't going to be easy. There were still fears to overcome, walls to break down. But in that moment, they both knew that they had something worth fighting for. Months passed, and the changes between Mark and Eleanor were undeniable. What had started as a business arrangement, a simple contract, had blossomed into something deeper, something real. Eleanor, the woman who had built an empire on control, had finally begun to let go of her fears. She had started to trust Mark in ways she never thought possible. For the first time in her life, she wasn't holding everything in her own hands. She was allowing someone else to share the burden, to walk beside her. Mark, for his part, had never been more certain of anything. The man who had once seen his future as a series of struggles and setbacks had now found something far more valuable. He had found love, not the kind that comes easily or without difficulty, but a love that had been built on trust, on vulnerability, and on the courage to open up. It wasn't perfect, and it hadn't been easy, but it was theirs. One evening, as they sat on the terrace, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Eleanor turned to Mark with a soft smile on her face. "You were right," she said, her voice light but sincere. "I didn't have to do it all alone. I didn't have to carry everything by myself." Mark reached over, taking her hand in his. "And you never will again," he said quietly. Eleanor's smile deepened, and for the first time, Mark saw the woman he had come to know. Not just the businesswoman, not just the woman who had once been locked behind walls of self-sufficiency, but a woman who was capable of love, of connection. It was as if all the pieces had finally fallen into place. I don't think I've ever been as happy as I am right now, Eleanor admitted, her eyes sparkling with emotion. Mark chuckled softly. Then we're in the right place. He squeezed her hand gently. Together. Eleanor nodded, her heart full. Together, she agreed. That night, after a quiet dinner, Eleanor stood in front of Mark, her eyes locked on his. For a moment, neither of them said anything. They simply looked at each other, letting the quiet moments speak louder than words ever could. Then, Eleanor took a deep breath and smiled, a smile that reached her eyes, that finally felt free. Mark, she said, her voice steady and warm. I've been thinking about this for a while now, and I want to make it official. Mark raised an eyebrow, a hint of curiosity in his expression. Official? Yes, Eleanor continued. I don't want to live in the shadows anymore. I want everyone to know who we are, what we've become. I want to make this, us, real in every way. Mark felt a rush of emotions. Hope, love, and the overwhelming certainty that they had come so far, that this was the beginning of something that would last. Eleanor, he said, his voice filled with warmth, I'm ready. He stepped forward, taking her hands in his, pulling her close. I've been ready for this. For us. Eleanor's smile grew even wider, and as they stood there, together, the weight of everything they had been through seemed to fall away. It wasn't about the empire, the wealth, or the business. It was about them, about the connection they had forged through trust, love, and the willingness to take a leap of faith. The next day, Mark and Eleanor walked into the same grand ballroom where they had first met, but this time, things were different. They weren't just two people playing a part in a contract. They were a team, ready to face whatever the future had in store, hand in hand. The guests, the business partners, and the friends who had once only seen them as a power couple now saw the love that had grown between them, the bond that had been formed through time, patience, and understanding. As they shared a quiet moment on the dance floor, Mark looked at Eleanor and whispered, We've come so far. Eleanor rested her head on his shoulder, smiling softly. And we'll keep going, she replied, her voice full of certainty. Together. And for the first time, Mark and Eleanor both knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together, with love, trust, and the strength of the bond they had built. It wasn't just a contract. Anymore, it was real. And that was all they needed.